The deal was already dead, not with a fight, but with silence. The kind that settles over a room like smoke, when 11 powerful people realize all at once that no one has understood anyone else all evening. 14 interpreters. 4 months of preparation. $300 million. All of it coming apart quietly on the 54th floor of Meridian Tower, somewhere above the city that never stops moving. Lawyers were closing folders. A Dubai investor was already on his feet. Then the door opened, and a man in a gray maintenance uniform stepped into the light, hands rough from cleaning solvent. A cracked photograph of a gap-toothed little girl pressed against his chest like a prayer. He looked at the room. The room looked back. And in the long silence that followed, he said the 4 words that no one in that room had expected from anyone, let alone from him. James Cole arrived at Meridian Tower at 8:50 on a Tuesday night, the same way he arrived every Tuesday, through the service entrance on 43rd Street badge, pressed to the reader before the second beep cartwheels, squeaking once on the polished concrete of the freight corridor, before he found the rhythm that kept them quiet. He knew this building the way you come to know anything you've spent 3 years inside, not by its architecture, but by its sounds. The hum of the elevator on the east shaft, the way the fluorescent light above the supply closet on 48 flickered twice before it caught. The particular silence of the upper floors after 9, when the last of the day shift stragglers finally gave up and went home. He rode to 54 alone. The floor was supposed to be empty. It wasn't. Light bled from under the main conference room doors, warm, amber-tinted, the kind that came from the ceiling panels being dimmed for a long session rather than bright work. James registered it the way he registered everything unusual on his rounds, quietly, without stopping. He positioned his cart at the far end of the hallway and started with the offices nearest the elevator bank, moving away from the noise rather than toward it. There was a photograph in the left breast pocket of his uniform. There always was. Emma, 8 years old, standing in front of a trifold board about the water cycle at her school science fair, grinning with the complete unself-consciousness of a child who had lost a front tooth and hadn't yet thought to be embarrassed about it. He'd taken the photo on a Thursday afternoon, one of maybe 4 Thursdays in the past year, when he'd made it home before she was already asleep. He didn't look at it. He didn't need to. He just knew it was there. Inside the conference room, the evening had been unraveling for the better part of an hour. Eleanor Voss sat at the head of the table, with the posture of someone who had long ago learned to keep every sign of strain above the jaw. 61 years old. CEO of Meridian Capital. She had spent 4 months engineering this meeting, every seat, every document, every agenda item arranged to move $300 million from negotiation into signature. The deal would finance the largest infrastructure development on the northeastern seaboard in 2 decades. She was not accustomed to watching things come apart. To her left, the Japanese delegation occupied one side of the table. At its head sat Kenji Mori, 67, vice chairman of one of Tokyo's most influential infrastructure conglomerates, a man who had conducted business across 4 continents for 40 years and still managed to give the impression that every room he entered was running slightly behind schedule. He had not raised his voice once in 2 days of negotiations. He hadn't needed to. Beside him, Nathan Reed handled the speaking, born in Los Angeles, raised in Tokyo. From age 9, his Japanese was native, and his English carried the particular precision of someone who'd learned early that being understood exactly was more important than being understood quickly. Nathan didn't translate so much as translate and calibrate, shaping each exchange for the person receiving it. Across the table sat Heinrich Bauer, who manufactured components for rail and highway systems, and who considered directness a professional virtue. He was 63 and German, and had never once pretended to find small talk useful. Next to Bauer was Khalid Mansour, the Dubai-based investor, whose capital underwrote the entire financial architecture of the deal, He had spoken fewer words than anyone else at the table over 2 days, but the quality of attention he gave to every exchange made it clear that he was absorbing considerably more than he offered. Sandra Park, the lead interpreter, sat between the two delegations with a leather notebook and 3 color-coded pens. 38 years old, 17 years of experience in financial and legal interpretation. She had worked rooms like this one before. She was good. Nobody in the room would have argued otherwise. That, in the end, was not the problem. It broke at 9:45. Bauer was speaking something about Phase 1 delivery windows, the language practical and unadorned the way all of his language was. Sandra rendered it into Japanese with the fluency of long practice, and the sentence was accurate in every word it contained. The problem lived not in what she said, but in what the word she chose implied. The Japanese term she selected carried a connotation of binding legal obligation, the kind that appears in contracts and triggers liability. What Bauer had actually expressed was something closer to a working commitment subject to revision the language of good faith, not legal exposure. Nathan Reed's reaction was immediate and contained. He said something in Japanese, short, controlled, angled with a precision that gave away nothing overtly, but telegraphed everything to anyone listening carefully enough. His voice didn't rise. It simply sharpened. Sandra translated his response. Eleanor's right index finger tapped the table once, the only outward sign she permitted herself. Bauer looked at Khalid. Khalid looked at nothing in particular, his gaze settling somewhere in the middle distance, and he did not look away. Something had broken. The room hadn't found a name for it yet. In the hallway, James was working his way toward the conference room end of the floor when he heard Nathan's voice through the glass partition. Not the words directed at the table, but what came after. Nathan had turned slightly toward the junior aide seated behind him, and he said something low and quick in Japanese, the kind of aside that assumed no one outside its intended receiver would follow it. They don't understand what we're actually arguing about. This isn't a scheduling dispute. This is a liability question. James kept moving the mop. He did not stop. He did not look up. He reached the alcove beside the conference room door, close enough now that he could see the room clearly through the glass panel beside the frame. Eleanor's controlled stillness, Bauer's jaw working slightly, Khalid's absolute quiet, the particular quality of a man deciding something rather than simply waiting. Sandra writing in her notebook with a pen that wasn't moving quite as fast as it had been an hour ago. He moved past. Eleanor called a break at 10. People stood, refilled water glasses, checked phones. The collective exhale that should have come with the break didn't. The room felt the same way it felt before, pressurized, the kind of pressure that came from everyone knowing the shape of the problem without being able to say it aloud. James brought his cart to a stop just outside the conference room door. Through the gap, 6 inches of open space where the door hadn't fully latched, he heard Nathan speaking to his aide again. Faster this time. Lower. The clause they were fighting over wasn't about delivery timelines. It was about the precise moment legal liability transferred between parties. In the contract, the English version placed that transfer at the point of delivery. What Maury's team understood, they were agreeing to what they'd been negotiating toward for 2 days, was liability, transferring at the point of formal acceptance. Between those two events lay a 48-hour window. Everything that had happened in this room tonight had been an argument conducted around the wrong question. James stood with one hand resting on the cart handle. He understood what he'd heard. He also understood what it meant to act on it. If he walked into that room, one complaint to building management from any of the 11 people inside for any reason, and the night shift was gone. The schedule that let him pick Emma up on Thursdays was gone. The fragile specific stability he'd spent 3 years constructing around a child who'd already lost enough was gone. He wasn't naive about how the math worked. If he didn't walk in, $300 million would dissolve tonight because of a translation error that he, standing in a hallway with a mop, was the only person in the building positioned to see clearly. He thought briefly of a Thursday afternoon, the science fair, the gap in Emma's smile. Then he set the card against the wall, straightened his uniform with one hand, and pushed open the door. The 11 most powerful people in the room turned toward him. He looked back at them, all of them, one face at a time, and said the only thing there was left to say. "I think I can help." Bauer reacted first, the way a man reacts when something unexpected enters a room he considers controlled. He looked at Eleanor with the expression of someone waiting for the host to handle it. Eleanor handled it. "Sir," her voice was measured, the temperature of it precisely calibrated, not hostile, not amused, not uncertain. "This is a private meeting. I need you to step outside." James didn't move. He kept one hand on the doorframe and spoke before the instruction could settle into the air as something final. The question Mr. Mansour raised about the liability clause wasn't translated correctly, he said. What he asked and what was conveyed in English are two different things. That's why Mr. Bauer pushed back, not because he disagreed with the clause, but because he was responding to something that was never actually said to him. The room changed. Not loudly, there was no outburst, no scraping of chairs. The change was in the quality of the attention, the way 11 people who had been managing their own calculations suddenly stopped managing them and looked at the same thing at the same time. Khalid Mansour turned in his chair. It was the first time all evening he had directed his full attention at any single person, and the effect of it was considerable. Sandra held her pen without writing, her chin lifted by a fraction, a small involuntary movement that said more in that room at that moment than most of what had been said aloud in the past hour. Eleanor looked at Sandra. Sandra looked back at her. 3 seconds passed between them, a conversation conducted entirely without words, the kind neither woman wanted to be having, but neither could honestly refuse. Then Eleanor slid a single sheet across the table toward James, the disputed clause printed in English and Arabic in parallel columns. "All right," Eleanor said. "Show me." James walked to the table. He read both columns without rushing the way someone reads something they are reading for precision rather than speed. Then he set the sheet down and addressed Khalid directly in Arabic, clean and economical, containing, within a few sentences, the full meaning of the original English clause. Something shifted in Khalid's expression. It was not dramatic. His jaw released a degree of tension that only someone who had been watching him for 2 days would have registered, but everyone in the room had been watching him for 2 days. Khalid answered. James listened, then turned to Eleanor. "He says the clause as translated implied liability transfers at the point of delivery. What he agreed to in principle was liability transferring at the point of formal acceptance. Those are 2 separate events, and in this contract, there is a 48-hour window between them." James set his hands flat on the table. "The entire dispute tonight has been about that 48 hours. Bauer reached for the German version of the same clause. He read it line by line, and his expression moved through several stages as he did. Before he could speak, James said, "The German version has the same problem. The word used for transfer defaults to the delivery meaning. You'd need a modifier to specify acceptance. The modifier isn't in the translation." Bauer put the paper down and looked at Eleanor. How did 3 translation firms miss this? Nobody answered. The question had already become secondary to everything else that needed to happen. There was also a subordinate clause, one of those inherited formulations that migrate between international contracts because no one questions language that has appeared in enough previous agreements. The clause carried a French phrase, force majeure, rendered differently in the English and Arabic versions, in a way that could produce meaningfully different interpretations under dispute. James noted it without ceremony, the way you note something you've already understood, and both versions were aligned before anyone thought to ask how he had read both simultaneously. Eleanor gestured toward the empty chair 2 seats from Sandra. James sat down. The first 30 minutes after that moved slowly, deliberately, one clause at a time. Questions were answered. Responses landed where they needed to. The liability transfer issue was resolved in principle within half an hour, the thing the entire evening had failed to accomplish. The tension in the room didn't warm. It changed character. It went from the kind that lives between people who can't understand each other to the kind that lives between people who understand each other well enough to disagree honestly. That was something different entirely, and everyone at the table recognized the difference, even if no one named it. Then James stopped. He was working through a standard indemnification clause, the kind that appears in most international agreements at this scale and rarely causes trouble. Bauer was presenting in German. James was moving the language into English and then into Japanese, and somewhere in the middle of it, he encountered a phrase in the German text and read it twice. Then he read the English version. Then the Arabic. The liability cap described in the German document was approximately 30% lower than the figure in the English and Arabic texts. If the contract were signed as it stood, and if a legal dispute arose at any point down the road, the parties who had signed the German and Arabic versions would be operating under a fundamentally different understanding of their maximum exposure. Not slightly different, structurally different. James looked at the page for a moment. He understood what he'd found. He understood what it meant to say it out loud. He had been accepted into this room in one capacity, a language correction tool. As long as he remained useful and contained within that role, he was tolerated. But what he was looking at now was not a translation error. It was a structural discrepancy in the contract itself, and naming it meant implying, however unintentionally, that one party had been negotiating toward an outcome the others hadn't agreed to. He knew how Bauer would receive this. He knew how Khalid would interpret it. He knew what Eleanor would have to do with it. He also knew that if he stayed quiet and the contract was signed, the 54th floor of this building would eventually receive a legal filing that traced its origins to this room, this night, this table. Mori spoke directly in Japanese without going through Nathan. It was the first time all evening he had addressed anyone other than his own delegation, and the room went still around it. He asked James whether the discrepancy was in his judgment, an error or an intention. The question was short and without accusation, but it carried the full weight of someone who understood that the answer mattered more than the asking. James looked at the page one more time. Then he looked at Mori. An error, he said, but the kind that needs to be corrected before anyone signs anything. He looked up at Eleanor. There's something else. The break lasted 22 minutes. Bauer stood in the far corner of the room, with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in the low, rapid German of someone receiving instructions rather than giving them. Khalid and his aide were going through the Arabic contract, page by page, marking in red. Nathan Reed had not left his seat. He was reading with the focused stillness of someone who had just realized he needed to read everything again. Mori had not moved from his chair either. He had been watching, not the documents, not the window, but the room itself, the way people moved through it, the distances they chose. At one point, he said something to his aide in a low voice, switching from Japanese into Korean. His aide, a Seoul-born logistics analyst who had worked with the delegation for 6 years, was the only person in the room Mori addressed in that language. James, refilling a water glass at the side table, heard it and understood it without reacting. Mori was asking whether the aide thought the German clause was an error or a choice. The aide said he didn't know. Mori said that was the right answer. James brought his water back to his seat and picked up the contract. There was a footnote in the technical appendix, a reference to supplementary specifications provided by a Brazilian subcontractor. The footnote was in Portuguese, and it contained a unit of measurement definition that cross-referenced against the English main text, introduced an ambiguity in the load capacity figures. Small. Not the kind of thing that would break a deal in normal negotiation. The kind of thing that surfaced in arbitration 3 years later. He found one more after that, a date format inconsistency in the milestone schedule that created a genuine ambiguity between the American and European conventions for reading month-day-year versus day-month-year. In one reading, the first review period ended 60 days after signing. In the other, it ended 31. James wrote both down on a notepad from the table. He turned the sheet face down. Eleanor brought the meeting back with the precision of someone who had spent 22 minutes constructing exactly how to do it. No blame assigned, no liability, admitted the discrepancy reframed as something to be corrected rather than explained. She offered an adjusted figure that addressed the liability cap gap. It was by any standard a composed piece of crisis management. Khalid was still holding the Arabic contract with the red markings. He spoke. His voice was unhurried and addressed to the center of the table rather than to Eleanor specifically, which in itself was a signal. James translated. He says if one clause was misaligned across 3 translations, he wants to understand how the rest of the document was reviewed before tonight. Bauer said in English this time. That is also my question. Nathan Reed spoke next. James rendered it evenly for the room. Mr. Reed says the delegation came here prepared to sign. They remain prepared to sign. But they will not sign a document they don't fully understand. And at this moment, they're not certain they do. Eleanor looked at James. What do you need? Mori spoke again directly in Japanese, bypassing Nathan for the second time that night. James translated. He's asking whether you can walk through every remaining clause, all of them, tonight. Every face in the room turned toward James. James reached for the notepad beside him. He turned it over. There are 2 more, he said. I found them during the break. They're smaller than the cap discrepancy, but they need to be addressed. He could see what the room was doing with this information. Not panic, something more careful than that. If he were concealing things, he wouldn't have surfaced them voluntarily. The fact that he had produced them before being asked did not resolve the larger question about the document, but it did quietly answer a different one. Nathan said something to Mori. Mori listened, then gave a single nod, the kind that means, continue, not agree. They were on the final clause when Bauer's attorney made his move. It was nearly 1 in the morning. The clause was dispute resolution, the last substantive section before the signature pages. The attorney presented a modification to the arbitration provision, framing it as a procedural clarification, a transfer of jurisdiction from a neutral international arbitration panel to a European body. The German-language version of the proposed change made it read as administrative rather than substantive. James translated it accurately. Then he sat and waited, because he already knew what was coming. Nathan Reed and Khalid Mansour reacted within seconds of each other. 2 languages, 1 message. The collision of their responses against the room's exhausted quiet was like a pressure change. Bauer's attorney said, "This is a standard modification." James translated Khalid's response. He says there is nothing standard about changing arbitration jurisdiction at midnight on the day of signing. Then Nathan, Mr. Reed says the delegation did not agree to European arbitration at any point in the negotiation. If this is a new condition, it needs to be presented as one. This is not a new condition, the attorney said. This is a clarification. Khalid rose from his chair. The room fractured not loudly, but in the way that was worse, each party withdrawing toward itself, the geometry of the table suddenly becoming visible as a set of opposing positions rather than a shared surface. Khalid's aide was gathering the marked-up contract. Nathan was speaking to Mori quickly and low. Bauer's attorney was arguing with Bauer. Eleanor said, "Ladies and gentlemen," and the sentence dissolved before it reached anyone. $300 million, 4 months of preparation. all of it coming apart because an attorney had tried to insert an unagreed clause into the document at 1 in the morning, 1 page before the signatures. James sat in the noise of it and didn't open a folder or check his notes. He looked at the room, at Khalid, who was standing but hadn't moved toward the door, at Maury, who was listening to Nathan but whose eyes were resting on the unsigned contract, at Bauer, who had turned away from the table and was arguing with his attorney in a voice that was lower than it should have been and angrier than he wanted it to appear. And in German spoken quietly enough that only James 2 seats away could have caught it, Bauer said to his attorney, "I told you not to bring this up tonight." James set both hands flat on the table. He stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He had no authority in this room, no title, no business card, no seat at the table that anyone had assigned him. What he had was a name. Mr. Mansour. It carried through the noise, the way a single clear note carries through a crowded room, not by volume, but by precision. Khalid looked toward him. James didn't root it through English first. He spoke directly in Arabic, and the choice itself was a statement. This was not a translation. This was a conversation. He told Khalid that he had been sitting in this room for 2 hours, and in that time, he had watched every party at the table negotiate in good faith. What had just been proposed was the mistake of one member of a legal team, not the position of the delegation that person was supposed to represent. He knew this because he had heard Heinrich Bauer say exactly that in German 30 seconds ago. Khalid's expression didn't shift dramatically, but his attention sharpened in a way that was visible to everyone watching, which was everyone. James turned to Nathan Reed. He didn't repeat what he'd said to Khalid. He rebuilt it, reshaped for the way Nathan received information, the way someone who understood both the language and the logic of the room would need to hear it. He said that Maury's delegation had arrived prepared to sign. The contract on the table corrected, clarified, walked through clause by clause, reflected what all parties had actually negotiated. The arbitration provision that had just been introduced did not belong to that document, and it did not need to be treated as though it did. Then he looked at Bauer. No preamble, no diplomatic cushion. In German, flat and direct, the way Bauer himself preferred things, tell your attorney to withdraw it. Bauer held James's gaze for 10 full seconds. It was the particular stillness of a man who was not accustomed to being instructed and was deciding in real time how he felt about it. His jaw moved slightly. Then he turned to his attorney and said in German, "Withdraw it," and something in the way he said. It made clear that the conversation between them was not finished, but that it was finished for tonight. The attorney withdrew the proposal. Khalid Mansour stood for another moment. He looked at the unsigned contract on the table. Then he pulled his chair back and sat down. The sound of it, one chair settling on a hardwood floor, was the clearest thing that had happened all evening. Maury spoke. He did not go through Nathan. For the second time that night, he addressed James directly in Japanese, and the room went still around it. He said, "You heard us from the hallway. You could have kept walking. It was not a question. It was not quite a thank you. It was the acknowledgement of someone who understood from long experience that the people who move through powerful rooms without being looked at are usually the ones who see those rooms most clearly, and that acting on what you see when you have no protection for doing so costs something real." James received it without deflection. He gave a single nod, the same economy Maury himself used, and turned back to the document. Nathan said quietly to no one in particular, "We can continue." There was no dramatic turn after that. No moment where the room exhaled all at once, or where someone said something that made everything feel resolved. There was only work, the careful, unhurried kind, one clause at a time, each one read, in the language it was drafted in, before being confirmed against the others. 18 minutes. At 1:23 in the morning, $300 million was signed into existence across 3 copies of a contract that everyone in the room for the first time that evening genuinely understood. The signature pages moved around the table in order. Maury signed with the deliberateness of someone for whom a signature was not a formality. Bauer signed without ceremony. Khalid signed last, set the pen down, and looked at the document for a moment before sliding it toward the center of the table. Eleanor signed last. She set her pen down and looked across the table at James with an expression that had traveled a considerable distance since the moment she'd told him to leave. Whatever calculation she was running, and she was always running one, it had arrived somewhere she hadn't anticipated at the start of the evening. "I'd like to meet with you," she said. "Not tonight. This week." James nodded. He didn't ask what the meeting would concern. He already understood the shape of it. Khalid rose from his chair and crossed the room. He extended his hand, and the handshake he offered was firm and without distance, the handshake of someone who was not performing a social ritual, but completing one. He said something in Arabic, and James translated it for the room without being asked, the way you share something that belongs to everyone. A man who speaks your language honestly is worth more than one who speaks it fluently. Maury collected his copy of the contract and straightened it against the table, a precise, unhurried gesture, then looked at James once more before turning toward the door. It was a brief look, clear and unambiguous, and it required nothing in return. Nathan Reed offered a firm nod as he gathered his materials, the nod of someone who recognized competence and was not too proud to show it. Bauer passed James on his way out. He stopped for half a step, the way someone stops when they've decided to say something, but haven't fully committed to the volume. He said it in German low enough that it wasn't meant for the room. "You were right about that, attorney." Then he kept walking. The room emptied the way rooms empty after long nights, gradually in groups with the particular quiet of people who were finished talking. Sandra Park was the last to gather her things. She closed her notebook, capped her pens, stacked the annotated pages into a folder with the practiced efficiency of 17 years. Then she walked past James toward the door, and she stopped. She didn't look at him directly. Her eyes went to the middle distance, somewhere toward the window, and the city beyond it, and she kept her hand resting on the back of a chair. "I heard that clause," she said. "I chose the safer translation." She didn't explain what she meant by safer. She didn't need to. In interpretation, the safer choice was the one that didn't draw attention, the word that fit cleanly, that no one would question, that got you through the sentence without incident. It was a professional instinct, and it had been wrong, and she was naming it without asking him to respond to it. James said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. Sandra picked up her bag and walked out. James stood alone in the conference room for a moment. The table held the evidence of the evening water glasses with rings at different levels, a scatter of annotated pages, 3 copies of a signed contract in a neat stack at the center. He began gathering what remained on his side of the table. The notepad, with the 2 discrepancies he'd found during the break, the pages he'd been handed throughout the night, the working notes in 3 different languages. He stacked them carefully, the way he handled everything in rooms that weren't his, lightly without noise, as though the space needed to be returned to what it had been before he arrived. He set the stack at the edge of the table where the morning staff would find it. His cart was where he'd left it in the hallway, outside the mop handle, angled at the same degree he'd left it at 3 hours ago. 3 more floors below this one. 53, 52, 51. Then the freight elevator, the locker room, the walk to the subway. He put his hand on the cart handle. The photograph was still in his breast pocket, the thing he'd been oriented toward all night without having to look at it directly, the way you don't need to look at a compass to know which direction you're walking. He started toward the elevator. The 54th floor fell quiet behind him, the particular quiet of a room that had held something significant and had now released it. He was home before 4 in the morning. Emma was asleep on her side, one arm extended toward the edge of the mattress, as if reaching for something just out of frame. He moved through the apartment without turning on the lights, set his keys on the counter, and sat down at the kitchen table in the dark with a glass of water in front of him. It had not changed what he was. He was still the man who came in through the service entrance, still the man who knew which elevator to take, and which hours meant the floors were empty, still the man with a cart and a mop, and a daughter who was missing a front tooth and growing a new one in its place, slowly on her own schedule the way children did. He thought about the moment Khalid had sat back down, the sound of that chair. One ordinary sound, in an ordinary room, and everything that had turned on it. He thought about Maury's voice, the directness of it, the lack of ceremony, and the thing he'd said that was not quite a thank you, but was more honest than most thank yous James had ever received. He thought about Emma at the science fair, standing in front of her board about the water cycle. The gap in her smile enormous and completely unself-conscious, as if losing something had never once suggested to her that it wouldn't grow back. James sat in the dark kitchen with the glass of water in front of him, and after a while, quietly, without any particular reason that he could have named, he smiled.